easiest for you to access in this moment. It could be something that just happened, or maybe it's grief that you have been carrying with you for a long time. Let that grief start to pool around your feet. Feel it as it rises up to your calves. How is this making you feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel worried that if you open the floodgates, you'll only drown? Add to those waters around you another depth of grief. Maybe one that you have been ignoring. Maybe one that you have dammed up. Something you have tried to divert away from yourself. I invite you to give up your defenses and to let it come. As you envision the waters of grief rising around you, trust that neither God nor this community will abandon you to the flood. Add now the systemic grief that you shoulder alongside of others. Maybe it's grief in this congregation, grief within your family, the weight of those you've buried, goodbyes you've had to say. Imagine now that the ocean of grief laps at your throat. Allow the flood to come. Add pandemic grief, climate change grief, the grief of political divisions and culture wars, the grief of actual wars, refugee crises. Finally, the waves are coming up almost over your head. Remember your baptism. Remember the drowning of all that came before. That underwater death moment on the other side of which is life and resurrection. Take a moment now to come up for air. To notice where grief has arisen in your body. To feel where you are holding it. Where is your heart? What made you feel afraid? What helped you feel hopeful? Notice your breath. And as you continue to breathe through all that you feel, I invite you to come back into this space of worship, bringing your whole self here. Noticing the community around you, feeling the presence of God holding you. You are here. You are safe. You are not alone. many of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a psychiatrist who developed this theory that there are 5 stages of grief. It was in the late 1960s when Dr. Kubler-Ross was working as a psychiatrist on the staff at the University of Chicago's Billings Hospital, helping people who were in the process of dying, that she started to notice what eventually developed into this theory of the 5 stages. Kubler-Ross had immigrated to the United States from Switzerland, where her experience of death and dying was very different than that of what she experienced here in the United States. At that time in Switzerland, people were dying at home, surrounded by their family and their friends. The focus was on comfort and helping the person who was dying to be at peace with that process. But when she came to the US, she experienced death as taboo. Here in America in the late 1960s and still today, people were dying alone in hospitals without adequate care or compassion from the medical staff. And so she started interviewing her patients, and from this research, she developed this model that outlined how people with terminal illness grapple with their diagnosis and the emotions along the way that they experience, right up to their impending death. In 1969, she published her groundbreaking book on death and dying, in which she outlines these 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Over the last 50 years, many others have expanded on these 5 stages of grief and looked at how they can apply not just to the experience of death, but to all kinds of losses. And today there is a broader acknowledgement that we don't experience grief as a linear process. We don't simply move from one stage to the next, because grief is complex, and people are different in how we process our grief. And so in 2019, a friend and colleague of Kubler-Ross, David Kessler, added a 6th stage of grief, making meaning, in which we integrate our experiences of grief and loss into our lives in order to help us find peace and hold on to hope. These days that we are living through are filled with grief. In addition to the predictable losses that come with being a human being, death and illness and natural life transitions, these past few years we have also been living through a global pandemic, a racial justice reckoning, and catastrophic climate change. There is suffering in each of our lives, in our families, in our church, and in the world around us. So much so that sometimes it threatens to overwhelm. But if we take the time to ground ourselves and to pause in the midst of all that is swirling around us, to remind ourselves that we are not alone in this, that we do in fact have deep resources that we can draw upon. It can be like someone is throwing us a spiritual life raft, a place where we can hold on and rest and breathe and gain perspective and strength so that we might keep going. The Reverend Colette Brody Grund created this grief lectionary that we are using during Lent to help Christians find comfort in times of grief, knowing that God's self and God's people throughout history have felt what we are feeling now, have lived what we are living, She writes, while so much of our culture, in both the broader church and society, discourages honest or extended talk about grief, the scriptures bear witness to a variety of grief expressions and responses. From the beginning, God's people have cried out in anger and lament, in disappointment and sadness. God not only responds to our grief, but exhibits their own deep and raw grief in the pages of the Bible. Because denying our grief will never be helpful to our healing. It may be how we are coping in this moment, but if we want to be able to move forward, to ultimately be able to find meaning in and through our losses, we have to acknowledge our grief. So during this Lenten season, we are going to give ourselves some space to do that. We will rely on the biblical witnesses and the support of this community to hold us in our grief. This story of the great flood in Genesis has often been interpreted as God's judgment on humankind for our wicked and sinful ways. God looks around at the creation and is so disappointed, so disgusted at the violence and corruption that plagues the earth that God just decides to wipe the slate clean and start over. Now, the writers of Genesis don't really elaborate on what it was exactly that caused God to finally give up and start over with creation, but it must have been irredeemable. Whatever was going on with humans at this time was so bad that even God felt like the only thing that could be done was just to flood the earth and begin again. So God takes one human family, a righteous man named Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives, and tells them to gather 7 pairs of each animal and load them into the ark. It takes some time for Noah to do this. But once they are finally ready to board the boat, the rain starts. The windows of the sky open up. And water of springs starts to break up forth from the ground. I think we often imagine that this flooding is just a rush of God's anger and frustration, a punishment that God casts upon the earth. But what if it isn't that at all? What if the water represents the tears of God over what has already been lost? What if God is weeping, no, sobbing, because now God has to destroy something that God loves because it is no longer good? Perhaps any of us who have had to walk away from a relationship, end a marriage, or set a firm boundary with an unhealthy person. Any of us who has had to leave a community, a church, a neighborhood, a childhood home that was broken and harmful to us. Any of us who has had to leave a job that at one point we really felt called to. Anyone who has had to leave home because of war or persecution or violence or natural disaster might know something about this kind of grief. Knowing that it is the right decision, that eventually something new and better will come from this ending, but it is still painful in the moment, this loss. For 40 days and nights, there was nothing but rain. Noah and his family were physically safe on the ark, but surely they also felt grief. They had lost everything. They were the only humans left on earth, and now it was up to them to work with God to begin again. After 150 days, that ark must have felt really claustrophobic, not to mention smelly. And then the rain finally stops, and Noah sends out bird after bird, waiting for them to come back with some sign that there would be a place on land for them to dock the ark, open the doors, and begin again. And so here we are in a season of Lent. And as one of the people that I consider one of my pastors, Kate Bowler, says, this is the season when we get to tell the truth about our lives, when we get to acknowledge the lives we actually have, and find the blessing that is here, woven into the messy reality of our whole selves. So we are going to spend this Lent sitting with our grief, not denying it, but making space for it together. We have done so well, haven't we? Soldiering on, keeping a stiff upper lip, trying our best, because sometimes that's what we have to do, just to survive. Just to keep showing up at work or for our families or just getting out of bed in the morning. But we also need to be able to bring our whole selves before the God who rejoices and weeps and sits beside us, who knows our joys as well as our grief, the God who knows how to bring life out of loss, the God of olive branches and rainbows and empty tombs. This God, our God, does not leave us alone in our grief, but when we are ready to wade into the water, it is God who helps us make it to the other side. We're going to hear a little more of this flood story now. And then as our guitar group plays, you're invited, if you are moved, to get up and go around the sanctuary. There are different places where there is water here. Water that you can drink, water that you can touch. You can take a shell with you. You can pour yourself a cup of water. Remember that water is also a blessing, a sign of God's provision, a sign of new life. And if you are at home with us on Zoom, you're also invited to get your own water so you can participate in this active response. There are a couple of reflection questions in your worship bulletin this morning that you can contemplate during this active response. This time is for you to reflect on what you need to reflect on and to speak to God the things that you need to say.
Genesis 8, verses 1 through 12. God remembered Noah, all those alive, and all the animals with him in the ark. God sent a wind over the earth so that the waters receded. The springs of the deep sea and the skies closed up. The skies held back the rain. The waters receded gradually from the earth. After 150 days, the waters decreased. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day, the ark came to rest on the Ararat mountains. The waters decreased gradually until the 10th month. And on the first day of the 10th month, the mountain peaks appeared. After 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. He sent out a raven, and it flew back and forth until the waters over the entire earth had dried up. Then he sent out a dove to see if the waters on all of the fertile land had subsided. But the dove found no place to set its foot. It returned to him in the ark, since waters still covered the entire earth. Noah stretched out his hand, took it, and brought it back into the ark. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out from the ark again. The dove came back to him in the evening, grasping a torn olive leaf in its beak. Then Noah knew that the waters were subsiding from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent out the dove, but it did not come back to him.